Some stories don't start with triumph. They start with a mother's voice cutting through your childhood like broken glass, telling you exactly what she thinks you'll never become. They start with the quiet certainty that no matter how hard you try, you'll always be the disappointment she predicted. I was the daughter who couldn't sit still, the one who asked too many questions, the one who never quite fit the mold she had crafted in her mind. For 18 years, I believed that restlessness was a flaw, that my hunger for something bigger was just another way I was failing her expectations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But mothers don't always know their daughters, and sometimes the very thing they see as weakness becomes the foundation of strength they never imagined possible. This is the story of how I went from being told I'd never amount to anything to the day elite Navy SEALs called me commander. This is the story of how rejection became my rocket fuel. The words hit me like a physical blow that December morning when I was 17. I was standing in our kitchen in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, still in my pajamas, holding my acceptance letter to the University of Iowa with a partial ROTC scholarship. My hands were shaking with excitement as I tried to explain what this meant, what I wanted to do with my life. But before I could finish my first sentence about serving my country, about making something of myself, my mother set down her coffee mug and looked at me with that expression I knew too well. The one that said she had already decided my future wasn't worth her time. Military? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sarah, you can't even keep your room clean for a week. You think you're going to make it through basic training? You think they're going to take orders from someone like you? She shook her head, turning back to the sink where she began washing dishes with more force than necessary. You'll be back home in 6 months, mark my words, probably pregnant and broke, just like I always said you would be. I stood there frozen, the letter trembling in my grip. This wasn't new. This was the soundtrack of my childhood, the constant reminder that I was somehow fundamentally flawed. Too loud, too stubborn, too impulsive. I was the daughter who climbed trees instead of playing with dolls, who got into fights defending kids who were being bullied, who spent hours reading military history books while other girls my age were learning to do their makeup. According to my mother, these weren't signs of strength or leadership. They were evidence that I was broken. My name is Sarah Chen, and that morning in our cramped kitchen, staring at my mother's rigid back as she scrubbed a pan that was already clean, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to spend one more day trying to convince her I was worth believing in. I was going to prove it to the world instead. Growing up as the middle child in a family of 5 kids, I learned early that love was conditional and attention was earned through compliance. My older brother Marcus was the golden child, the one destined for medical school, the one whose every achievement was celebrated with family dinners and proud phone calls to relatives. My younger sister Lisa was the baby, sweet and docile, never causing trouble, always earning gentle smiles and patient explanations when she made mistakes. Then there were the twins, Jake and Emma, who were easy to manage because they had each other and never demanded much individual attention. And then there was me, the one who questioned why we had to go to church every Sunday when the pastor said things that didn't make sense, the one who got suspended in 5th grade for punching Tommy Morrison when he wouldn't stop pulling Maria Gonzalez's hair, the one who stayed up late reading about World War II battles while my siblings slept peacefully in their beds. I was the disruption in my mother's carefully ordered world, the child who reminded her daily that control was an illusion. My father worked double shift at the John Deere plant and was rarely home, but when he was, he mostly stayed quiet during my mother's lectures about my character defects. He'd give me a tired smile sometimes, ruffle my hair, but he never contradicted her, never stood up for me, never suggested that maybe my restlessness wasn't a character flaw, but a sign that I needed something bigger to channel my energy into. The pattern was established early. Marcus got praise for his good grades. Lisa got patience when she struggled. The twins got gentle guidance. I got criticism wrapped in concerned sighs. When I made honor roll, it was about time you applied yourself. When I won the school wrestling tournament in 8th grade, it was fighting again, Sarah? When are you going to learn to act like a lady? When I organized a food drive that collected over 1,000 cans for the local shelter, it was showing off doesn't make you special. But it was the night of my high school graduation that really crystallized everything for me. I had graduated third in my class, earned that ROTC scholarship, and been accepted to 5 different universities. I thought maybe, finally, she would see that I wasn't the failure she had predicted. Instead, during the reception at our house, I overheard her talking to Mrs. Henderson from next door. "We're so proud of Marcus starting at Iowa State for pre-med," she was saying, her voice warm with genuine pride. "And little Lisa just got accepted to that prestigious art program. The twins are doing so well in their AP classes, too." There was a pause, and then Mrs. Henderson asked about me. My mother's voice changed, became flat and dismissive. "Oh, Sarah's going off to play soldier. We'll see how long that lasts. You know how she is with commitment." I stood there in the hallway, still wearing my graduation dress, holding a piece of cake I suddenly couldn't swallow. That was the moment I understood that no amount of achievement would ever change her mind about me. She had decided who I was when I was 5 years old and refused to see any evidence to the contrary. I was the problem child, the disappointment, the one who would inevitably fail because that's what problem children do. But what she didn't understand, what she never saw, was that her constant predictions of my failure had been building something inside me. Every time she said I couldn't, every time she rolled her eyes at my dreams, every time she compared me unfavorably to my siblings, she was adding fuel to a fire that would eventually burn bright enough to light my way to places she could never imagine. That night, I made myself a promise. I was going to succeed, not to prove her wrong, but to prove myself right. I was going to take all that restless energy, all that stubborn determination she saw as character flaws, and I was going to forge them into something unbreakable. I was going to become exactly who I was meant to be, with or without her approval. 3 weeks later, I left for the University of Iowa with 2 suitcases and a heart full of quiet determination. My mother didn't cry when I left. She didn't offer any last-minute words of encouragement or support. She just reminded me that my room would be converted to a craft space while I was gone, and that I shouldn't expect them to hold it for me when I inevitably came crawling back. I never looked back, not once.
Because sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give you is the unshakable certainty that you have to save yourself. And sometimes salvation comes in the form of combat boots, a rifle, and the kind of training that strips away everything you think you know about your own limitations and rebuilds you into something stronger than you ever imagined possible. The day I walked onto that university campus, I wasn't just starting college. I was beginning the process of becoming someone my mother had never seen coming, someone who would one day stand in front of the most elite warriors in the world and earn the right to be called their leader, someone who would transform every doubt she had planted into unshakable confidence, every criticism into unstoppable drive, every prediction of failure into a stepping stone towards something extraordinary. But that transformation wouldn't happen overnight. First, I had to survive what was coming next. The first time I hit the ground during combatives training, I tasted blood and dirt and something else I couldn't name. It was week 3 of ROTC summer training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and Drill Sergeant Martinez had just demonstrated why cockiness gets you flattened in about 2 seconds flat. I was lying there, staring up at the blazing July sun, when I heard him bark, "Chen, you planning to take a nap down there, or are you going to get up and try again?" I rolled over, spat out a mouthful of Kentucky Clare, and pushed myself to my feet. My ribs ached where his elbow had connected, and my pride stung worse than the scrape on my chin. But as I squared my shoulders and raised my hands again, something clicked into place. This wasn't about proving I could take a hit. This was about proving I could get back up, and I could do that all day long. "Again," I said, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not approval, not yet, but recognition. The truth was, those first months of military training nearly broke me in ways I hadn't expected. Not physically. I had been preparing for that. I had spent my senior year running 5 miles every morning before school, doing push-ups until my arms shook, practicing pull-ups on the rusty bar my dad had installed in our garage years ago. I thought I was ready for the physical demands. What I wasn't ready for was how the structure would expose every insecurity my mother had planted in my mind like landmines waiting to explode. When you're sleep-deprived, running on 3 hours of rest and instant coffee, when every muscle in your body screams and your brain feels like it's wrapped in cotton, all your careful defenses crumble.
Those first weeks, lying in my narrow bunk at night, I could hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. You can't even keep your room clean for a week. The barracks had to be spotless every morning, beds made with hospital corners so tight a quarter would bounce off them. You think they're going to take orders from someone like you? I was learning to give commands with authority I didn't yet feel, to project confidence when doubt gnawed at my stomach like hunger. But the military is a strange alchemy. It takes your weaknesses and either forges them into strengths or burns them away entirely. That restlessness my mother had always criticized became an asset when we had to stay alert during 20-hour field exercises. My tendency to question authority transformed into tactical thinking when instructors wanted us to problem solve under pressure. The stubbornness that had driven her to distraction became the backbone that kept me upright when other cadets were dropping out, citing stress or homesickness or simple exhaustion. By my junior year at Iowa, I wasn't just surviving the program, I was excelling. I had earned my place as Cadet Battalion Commander, leading nearly 400 other students through training exercises and ceremonies. My academic grades were solid, but more importantly, I was developing something I had never possessed before: unshakable confidence in my own judgment. When you've successfully navigated a squad through hostile territory during a simulated mission, when you've made split-second decisions that kept your people safe, when you've earned the respect of peers and instructors through competence rather than compliance, you start to understand what real strength feels like. The phone calls home became less frequent as the months passed, not because I was too busy, though I was, but because I was changing in ways that made conversations with my family feel like speaking through glass. When I did call, my mother's responses followed the same predictable pattern. She'd ask about my grades, make vague comments about the dangers of military life, and inevitably steer the conversation towards my siblings' accomplishments. Marcus was thriving in medical school. Lisa had won a scholarship for her art. The twins were headed to excellent colleges. And me? Well, I was still playing soldier, as she put it, though she had stopped making predictions about when I would quit and come home. The truth was, I had found home, not in the barracks or the training grounds, but in the version of myself that was emerging under pressure and discipline. I was becoming someone I actually liked, someone I respected. The girl who had stood in that Cedar Rapids kitchen holding an acceptance letter with trembling hands was still there, but she was wrapped now in layers of competence and quiet confidence that no amount of maternal disapproval could strip away. During my senior year, everything changed again. I was selected for a specialized leadership program that would fast-track me towards working with elite military units. The selection process was grueling: weeks of psychological evaluations, physical tests that pushed beyond normal limits, and scenario-based assessments that felt more like interrogations than interviews. Out of 60 candidates, 12 were chosen. I was one of 3 women. The program took place at a facility I can't name, with instructors whose backgrounds were classified at levels I didn't have clearance to know. What I can tell you is that it was there I learned the difference between being tough and being unbreakable. Tough meant you could absorb punishment and keep going. Unbreakable meant you could absorb punishment, keep going, and still maintain the clarity of mind to lead others through whatever hell you are all walking through together. We learned advanced tactical operations, psychological warfare resistance, and something they called adaptive leadership under extreme duress. That last one was exactly what it sounded like. They would put us in impossible situations with incomplete information, conflicting orders, and lives hanging on the balance, and then see if we could think our way out while maintaining command authority. It was during one of these exercises that I first heard the phrase that would change my life. We were 8 hours into a hostage rescue simulation. I was team leader for a mixed group of candidates, and everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. Our primary extraction route was compromised. 2 of my team members were simulating injuries, the hostages were panicking, and our communication with command had gone dark. We were running out of time, ammunition, and options. That's when I made the call that would define everything that came after. Instead of following protocol, which would have meant waiting for backup that might not come in time, I split my team. Half would create a diversion, while the other half extracted the hostages through a route that wasn't in any manual, but that I had identified during reconnaissance. It was risky, unorthodox, and completely against standard operating procedure. It also worked.
Afterwards, as we sat through the debriefing, the lead instructor, a man whose chest was covered in ribbons I couldn't even identify, looked at me with something I had never seen in anyone's eyes before: respect. Not the grudging acknowledgement you get for meeting expectations, but genuine respect for exceeding them. That was good thinking under pressure, Chen. You've got the instincts for this work. But it was what he said next that stopped my heart.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We're going to recommend you for special operations training. There's a unit that could use someone with your particular skill set. I sat there, trying to process what he was saying. Special operations meant working with the best of the best. It meant assignments that would test everything I thought I knew about my own capabilities. It meant entering a world where being underestimated could be the edge that kept you alive. That night, alone in my quarters, I called home for the first time in 3 months. My mother answered on the 4th ring, her voice cautious. "Sarah? Is everything okay? You usually don't call this late." I took a deep breath. "I wanted to let you know I've been selected for advanced training, special operations." There was a long pause. Then, predictably, "What does that mean exactly? Are you going to be in more danger?" "It means I'm being trained to work with elite units, to lead them." Another pause, longer this time. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing." That was it. No congratulations, no pride in her voice, no recognition that her daughter had just achieved something extraordinary, just the same old doubt wrapped in false concern. I hung up, feeling hollow but also strangely liberated. I had stopped waiting for her approval without even realizing it. The next morning, I began preparing for the next phase of my transformation. I was about to learn that everything I thought I knew about strength, leadership, and my own limitations was just the beginning. I was about to discover what it felt like to earn the respect of warriors who had seen everything the world could throw at them and had not only survived, but had emerged as legends. But first, I had to survive what they were about to put me through. And despite everything my mother had always believed about me, I was more than ready. The first thing they tell you about special operations training is nothing. The second thing they tell you is that most people don't make it past the first week. By the time I arrived at the classified facility in Virginia, I had already signed more non-disclosure agreements than I could count, and I understood that the next 6 months would either make me or destroy every assumption I had about human endurance. What they don't tell you is that the hardest part isn't the physical torture, though there's plenty of that. It's not the sleep deprivation or the psychological warfare or even the constant threat of failure. The hardest part is the moment when you realize that everything you thought made you tough was just preparation for discovering what actually unbreakable looks like. My class started with 18 candidates. 3 were women, including me. By the end of the first month, we were down to 11. Sarah Martinez, a former Marine, had torn her ACL during a rope exercise. James Wilson, who looked like he could bench press a truck, had washed out during psychological evaluation when the instructors discovered he couldn't function under extreme stress without losing his temper. Others simply rang the bell, as they called it, walking away when the pressure became more than they could bear. But I was still there, and every day I stayed was another day I proved my mother wrong about who I was capable of becoming. Every dawn run through freezing rain, every night mission where we navigated hostile territory with faulty equipment, every simulated interrogation where they tried to break our mental defenses, I felt myself becoming someone harder and more precise than the girl who had left Iowa with 2 suitcases and wounded pride. The training was designed to strip away everything comfortable and familiar until only your core remained. They put us through scenarios that had no right answers, only degrees of failure, and then demanded we lead others through the chaos anyway. We learned to make life or death decisions with incomplete information while running on 2 hours of sleep and nothing but protein bars for sustenance. We practiced combat medicine on mannequins that bled realistic amounts of fake blood until our hands stopped shaking when we saw wounds that would have made us vomit 6 months earlier. But it was during week 14 that everything changed for me. We were running a joint training exercise with an active Navy SEAL team. The first time any of us candidates had worked alongside operators who were already deployed in the field. Their reputation preceded them like legend. These were men who had seen combat in places whose names were classified, who moved through dangerous territory like ghosts, who could neutralize threats before their targets even knew they were there. I expected them to be hostile to our presence. I expected them to test us, to see if we would crack under the pressure of working alongside genuine legends. What I didn't expect was to be placed in command of a mixed unit that included both candidates and active SEALs for a high-stakes rescue mission simulation. The scenario was brutal in its complexity. A diplomat had been kidnapped in a hostile urban environment. Intelligence suggested multiple locations where he might be held. Time was running out. The enemy had superior numbers and knew the terrain better than we did. Our mission was to locate and extract the target while minimizing civilian casualties and avoiding international incident. Standing in that briefing room, looking at a map covered in red zones and uncertain intelligence, I felt the weight of every doubt my mother had ever planted in my mind. These SEALs had more combat experience in their little fingers than I had in my entire body. They had earned their reputations through blood and sacrifice in real battlefields where mistakes meant actual death, not just exercise failure. Who was I to think I could lead them anywhere? But then I looked closer at the tactical problem in front of us, and something clicked. Not confidence exactly, but clarity. I could see patterns in the intelligence that others were missing, connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information that suggested a solution nobody else was considering. "The third location," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's a decoy. They want us to waste resources checking the obvious targets while they move the asset to this building here." I pointed to a structure that hadn't even been flagged as a possibility by intelligence. Petty Officer Rodriguez, a SEAL with eyes like winter stone, studied the map where I was pointing. "Explain your reasoning, Chen." I walked them through my analysis, the pattern of enemy movements, the timing of intelligence leaks, the fact that the third location was almost too convenient in its accessibility. It was a trap designed to draw our attention while the real operation happened elsewhere. There was silence in the room. Then Chief Petty Officer Thompson, a man whose chest held ribbons from conflicts I wasn't cleared to know about, nodded slowly. "That's solid tactical thinking. How do you want to proceed?" They weren't just testing my analysis.
They were asking me to plan and execute a mission that involved their lives, even in simulation. The girl from Cedar Rapids, who had been told she would never amount to anything, was being asked to lead Navy SEALs into combat. I split our forces into 3 teams. One would create a visible approach to the obvious target, maintaining the illusion that we had fallen for their misdirection. Another would position as backup and overwatch. My team would infiltrate the real location and execute the extraction. It was risky, requiring precise timing and coordination between groups that had never worked together before. "Chen," Chief Thompson said as we prepared to move out, "you sure about this plan?" I met his gaze directly. "No, Chief, I'm not sure about anything. But it's the best chance we have of bringing everyone home." He smiled then, a quick flash of approval that hit me harder than any medal. "Then let's go get our guy." The mission itself was a blur of controlled chaos, moving through urban terrain, communicating through hand signals and whispered radio transmissions, coordinating 3 separate teams while adapting to changing circumstances in real time. When we breached the target building, my analysis proved correct. The diplomat was there, guarded by hostile forces who clearly hadn't expected us to find their actual location, but it was what happened afterward that changed my life forever. As we conducted the post-mission debrief, Chief Thompson stood up and did something I never saw coming. He looked around the room at his team, men who had served together through multiple deployments, who had earned their trident through trials that were classified above my clearance level. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned every word. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I've worked with officers from every branch, with operators from allied nations, with people who had more medals than a pawn shop. But I've never seen anyone
especially not a candidate still in training. Read a tactical situation that clearly, and then execute a plan that flawlessly under pressure. He turned to me then, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen directed at me before. Not approval, not encouragement, but recognition. The kind of respect that can't be earned through politics or favoritism, only through competence demonstrated under fire. Chen, if you were already commissioned, I'd request you for my unit without hesitation. You've got the instincts for this work, and more than that, you've got the judgment to lead people through situations where there are no good choices, only degrees of risk. Then he said the words that rewrote every story my mother had ever told me about who I was and what I was worth. It would be an honor to call you commander. The room went quiet, not because what he said was inappropriate, but because everyone present understood the weight of it. These men didn't give their respect lightly. They had seen too much and lost too many to waste words on pleasantries or false encouragement. When they said something, they meant it. I stood there, still in my tactical gear, still covered in dust and sweat from the exercise, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not pride, exactly, though there was that, but something deeper. A quiet, unshakable knowledge that I had become exactly who I was meant to be, despite every prediction to the contrary. That night, alone in my quarters, I called home one last time. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice wary as always when she saw my number. "Sarah? It's late. Is everything all right?" "It's fine, Mom. I just wanted to let you know I've completed my training. I'll be commissioned as an officer next month." "Oh." A pause. "Well, that's nice, I suppose. Will you be coming home for a visit?" I looked around my sparse quarters, at the gear I would carry into places whose names I couldn't tell her, at the life I had built from the ashes of her expectations. "No, Mom, I won't be coming home. This is home now." Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the realization that you don't need anyone's permission to become who you were always meant to be. And sometimes the people who say you'll never amount to anything are just describing the limits of their own imagination, not the boundaries of your potential. The Navy SEALs had called me commander, but more than that, I had finally learned to call myself worthy. And that made all the difference in the world. 5 years into my military career, I was deployed to a forward operating base in Afghanistan, whose exact location remains classified. What I can tell you is that it was a place where the temperature swung between freezing and scorching, depending on the time of day, where dust got into everything, including your dreams, and where the line between life and death was measured in split-second decisions, and the quality of intelligence you received from sources you couldn't always trust. I was serving as a liaison officer between special operations teams and local military units, coordinating missions that required cultural knowledge, tactical expertise, and the kind of diplomatic skills they don't teach you in combat training. It was challenging work that demanded I bridge the gap between different military cultures, different languages, and different approaches to warfare. But it was exactly the kind of complex problem-solving that had drawn me to the military in the first place. The mission that changed everything came down through channels on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. A group of humanitarian workers had been taken hostage by insurgents in a remote mountain village. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Local forces lacked the specialized training for a rescue operation in that terrain. Coalition forces were stretched thin across multiple operations. Time was running out, and every hour that passed increased the likelihood that the hostages would be moved to a location where rescue would become impossible. I was in the command center when the call came through from Colonel Martinez, requesting an immediate briefing on available assets for a rescue operation. As I laid out the tactical situation, the limited resources, and the compressed timeline, I found myself doing something I hadn't planned. I was presenting a mission proposal. "Sir, I recommend a joint operation using elements from the 75th Ranger Regiment for assault capability, combined with local forces who know the terrain intimately.
I can serve as the coordination element, ensuring communication between American and Afghan units while providing real-time tactical assessment. Colonel Martinez studied the operational map I had prepared, his expression unreadable. You're talking about leading a mixed nationality unit into hostile territory with multiple unknown variables? That's not liaison work, Chen. That's command.
Yes, sir, it is. There was a long moment of silence in the command center. Then Colonel Martinez did something that reminded me why I had chosen to serve under officers like him. He looked around the room at the other staff officers, then back at me. The mission is yours, Lieutenant Commander Chen. You have operational authority over all assigned assets. Bring those people home. What happened over the next 18 hours tested every assumption I had ever made about leadership, courage, and the weight of decisions that carry human lives in their balance. Leading a team of Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Afghan Special Forces through mountain terrain in pursuit of hostages held by people who would kill them rather than surrender them required a level of coordination and cultural sensitivity that no training manual could have prepared me for. The Rangers were used to overwhelming firepower and direct assault tactics. The SEALs preferred stealth and precision strikes. The Afghan forces knew the local terrain and customs, but had different roles of engagement and different priorities. My job was to blend these different approaches into a coherent strategy that would maximize our chances of success while minimizing casualties on all sides. But it was during the final assault phase that something extraordinary happened. We had located the hostages in a compound built into the mountainside, surrounded by terrain that offered multiple escape routes for the insurgents, but limited approach options for us. As I coordinated the three-pronged assault through my headset, managing moving pieces across several kilometers of hostile territory, I realized that the voice in my earpiece had changed. Master Chief Petty Officer Williams, the SEAL team leader, had stopped referring to me by rank. Instead, he was using a different term, one that carried weight I was only beginning to understand. Commander, we have eyes on the target building, awaiting your orders. Commander, not Lieutenant Commander, not Chen, not ma'am. Commander, the title that meant these warriors, these men who had earned their positions through blood and sacrifice in the world's most dangerous places, saw me as their leader, not because of my rank, but because of my competence. The assault itself lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, all 6 hostages were safe, 3 insurgents were captured, and we had suffered only minor injuries among our own forces. But more importantly, we had executed a complex operation requiring coordination between multiple military cultures and different tactical approaches without a single communication breakdown or friendly fire incident. During the debrief, Captain Rodriguez from the Ranger unit said something that still gives me chills when I remember it. I've been doing this for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone manage that level of operational complexity with that degree of calm. You didn't just coordinate that mission, Commander. You conducted it like a symphony. Master Chief Williams nodded his agreement. Request permission to commend Lieutenant Commander Chen for exceptional leadership under combat conditions. She has the instincts and judgment to lead special operations personnel in any theater. But it was what happened 3 days later that truly drove home how far I had traveled from that kitchen in Cedar Rapids. I was sitting in my quarters, writing operational reports and trying to process what we had accomplished, when my satellite phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice that answered when I picked up was not. Sarah? This is your brother Marcus. I hadn't spoken to any of my family in over a year. The surprise of hearing his voice made me forget, momentarily, where I was and what I had just accomplished. Marcus? How did you get this number? Mom has been trying to reach you. She saw something on the news about American forces rescuing hostages in Afghanistan. Your name was mentioned in the report as the commanding officer. Sarah, they said you led the mission. There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not the condescending tone he had used when we were growing up, not the dismissive way he had always spoken about my military career. This was something different, something that sounded almost like respect. Yeah, I led the mission. We brought everyone home safe. Sarah, He paused, and I could hear him struggling with words. I called because Mom wanted me to, but also because I needed to say something.
I've been watching the news coverage, reading about what you do over there. I never understood before. I never realized what you had become. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the mountains where, 3 days earlier, I had coordinated a rescue operation that had saved 6 lives. What do you mean? I mean, you're a hero, Sarah. A real hero. And I've spent our whole lives thinking Mom was right about you, that you were just the troublemaker, the one who couldn't settle down. But you didn't need to settle down. You needed to find something worth fighting for. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Marcus told me about his work as a pediatric surgeon, about how he had started volunteering with veterans organizations after learning more about my military service. He told me that Lisa had been following my career through military websites, that she had articles about our unit's operations taped to her refrigerator. Even the twins, now in college, had started telling people about their sister who served with Special Operations Forces overseas. But it was what he said about our mother that stopped me cold. She's been telling people at church about you, Sarah. About her daughter, the war hero. She keeps a copy of that news article in her purse and shows it to anyone who will listen. I think she's proud, but doesn't know how to say it. Proud. The word felt foreign when applied to my mother's feelings about me. For so many years, I had carried her voice in my head like a curse, letting her predictions of failure drive me towards success that I hoped might finally change her mind about who I was. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped needing her approval.
I had found something stronger than her doubt. I had found my own certainty. After the call ended, I sat in the growing darkness of the Afghan evening and thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the girl who couldn't keep her room clean to the officer who had just successfully coordinated a multinational rescue operation. From the daughter who would never amount to anything to the commander whom Navy SEALs trusted with their lives. But the most important transformation wasn't in how others saw me, it was in how I saw myself. I no longer needed external validation to know my worth. I had become someone who created safety for others, who solved problems that seemed impossible, who led people through darkness toward light. I had become exactly who I was meant to be, not despite my mother's expectations, but because I had learned to exceed them. The next morning, I received orders for my next assignment. I was being transferred to a joint task force responsible for training international special operations personnel. It was a promotion that would put me in charge of developing the next generation of elite warriors, teaching them not just tactics and techniques, but the kind of leadership that transforms individuals into teams and teams into forces capable of achieving the impossible. As I packed my gear for the journey to my new post, I found myself thinking not about the recognition or the advancement, but about the responsibility. Somewhere, there might be a young person who had been told they would never amount to anything, who carried doubt like a weight in their chest, who needed someone to show them that their restlessness and stubbornness and refusal to accept limitations weren't character flaws, but the raw materials of greatness. I had become that someone. And that, more than any title or commendation, was the victory that mattered most. 3 years after that rescue mission in Afghanistan, I found myself standing in front of the Special Operations Training Center in Tampa, Florida, not as a student this time, but as the newly appointed Director of Leadership Development. At 32 years old, I was the youngest person ever to hold this position, and the first woman to oversee the training of elite operators from all branches of the military. The weight of this responsibility was not lost on me. Every day, I would be shaping the minds and capabilities of warriors who would go on to execute missions in the world's most dangerous places. These men and women would face situations where their training would determine not just their own survival, but the lives of hostages, civilians, and their teammates. The decisions I made in designing their leadership curriculum would ripple outward into operations I would never see, in countries I would never visit, affecting outcomes I would never fully know. But it wasn't the scope of the responsibility that challenged me most. It was the mirror it held up to my own journey. Because among the candidates who came through our programs, I began to see reflections of myself at different stages of transformation. Young officers who had been told they weren't cut out for leadership roles, enlisted personnel who carried themselves like they were apologizing for taking up space, soldiers who had been written off by previous instructors as too impulsive, too emotional, too unconventional for special operations work. I saw them because I had been them, and I understood something that I suspect many of my colleagues did not, that the qualities others saw as weaknesses were often the raw materials of extraordinary leadership, waiting for the right pressure and the right environment to transform into strengths. Lieutenant Jessica Walsh was one of those candidates. She arrived at our program with a file full of contradictions, exceptional test scores coupled with disciplinary actions for questioning orders, outstanding performance in individual challenges paired with struggles in traditional team-building exercises. Her previous instructors described her as brilliant but unmanageable, tactically sound but socially difficult, and, most damning of all, not leadership material. I recognized her, not because we looked alike or came from similar backgrounds, but because she carried herself with the same defensive energy I had worn like armor. She was always ready for someone to tell her she didn't belong, always braced for the criticism that would confirm her worst fears about herself. In team meetings, she would present ideas with the kind of hesitant confidence that suggested she expected to be shot down. During physical training, she pushed herself beyond reasonable limits, as if trying to compensate for some fundamental inadequacies that existed only in her own mind. The first time I spoke with her privately, she sat across from my desk with the rigid posture of someone preparing for bad news. Her file lay open between us, a catalog of mixed reviews and conflicting assessments that told the story of a young officer who had never quite fit the mold others expected her to fill. "Tell me about your leadership philosophy, Lieutenant Walsh," I said, settling back in my chair. She blinked, clearly surprised by the question. "Ma'am?" "Your approach to leadership. How do you think about guiding and directing others?" She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "I think most people know more than they give themselves credit for. I think the job of a leader is to create space for that knowledge to emerge, rather than imposing your own ideas on situations you might not fully understand." It was a sophisticated answer, one that revealed deep thinking about the nature of authority and collaboration. But she delivered it like she was confessing to a crime, as if having her own philosophy about leadership was somehow presumptuous. "That's an interesting perspective," I said. "Have you had instructors who disagreed with that approach?" Her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Some have suggested that I lack decisive leadership qualities, that I ask too many questions and seek too much input before making decisions." I leaned forward slightly. "And what do you think about that feedback?" "I think," she said slowly, "that there's a difference between decisiveness and rushing to judgment. I think the best decisions often come from gathering multiple perspectives, even when time is limited. But I also think that maybe I'm wrong about that, since multiple instructors have identified it as a weakness." There it was, the voice of doubt that I knew so well, the willingness to abandon her own judgment in favor of external validation. The same voice that had whispered in my own ear for years, telling me that my instincts were probably wrong, that others knew better, that my way of thinking was fundamentally flawed. "Lieutenant, I want you to consider something," I said. "What if the quality that some instructors see as indecisiveness is actually one of your greatest leadership strengths? What if your instinct to gather input and consider multiple perspectives before acting is exactly what makes you capable of leading complex operations with multiple stakeholders and unclear parameters?" She looked at me with the same expression I had probably worn years earlier when Chief Thompson first told me I had the instincts for special operations work. Surprise, hope, and disbelief warring across her features. Over the following weeks, I worked with Lieutenant Walsh not to change her leadership style, but to refine it and help her understand its value. I assigned her to lead exercises that required building consensus among diverse groups. I put her in charge of missions where gathering intelligence from multiple sources was critical to success. I created scenarios where her tendency to ask questions and seek input became advantages rather than liabilities. And I watched her transform, not into someone different, but into a more confident version of who she had always been. Her hesitant confidence became thoughtful decisiveness. Her defensive energy transformed into quiet authority. She began to carry herself like someone who belonged in leadership positions because she understood that her particular approach to leadership was valuable
even if it didn't match traditional models. But Lieutenant Walsh was just one of many candidates who passed through our program during my tenure.
There was Captain Rodriguez, a former gang member from East Los Angeles, who had been told that his background made him unsuitable for working with international allies until he successfully negotiated the release of captured soldiers using street-learned skills that no military manual could have taught him. There was Sergeant Kim, a soft-spoken logistics specialist who had been overlooked for leadership roles because she didn't fit the aggressive model of command until she developed new protocols for managing complex supply chains in hostile environments that revolutionized how we supported extended operations. Each of these officers taught me something about the nature of leadership and the danger of narrow definitions of what makes someone capable of guiding others through crisis. As word of our program's success began to spread throughout the special operations community, I started receiving requests to speak at military academies, leadership conferences, and training facilities around the world. The invitations always followed the same pattern. They wanted to hear about our innovative approaches to leadership development or our breakthrough methods for identifying unconventional talent. But what they really wanted to understand was how we had managed to produce officers who consistently outperformed expectations in the field, who led successful missions in impossible circumstances, who earned the respect and loyalty of their teams in ways that traditional leadership training hadn't been able to replicate. The answer, I would tell them, wasn't innovation or breakthrough methods, it was recognition. Recognition that leadership takes many forms, that strength can look like sensitivity, that the best decisions often come from people who think differently rather than people who think the same way everyone else does. During one of these speaking engagements at the Naval Academy, a young midshipman approached me after my presentation. She was small, maybe 5 feet 2 inches tall, with the kind of intense focus that reminded me of myself at her age. She waited until the crowd had dispersed before approaching, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had been carrying doubt for a long time. "Ma'am, I've been told by multiple instructors that I don't have the physical presence to command respect from enlisted personnel. They've suggested that I consider intelligence or logistics rather than pursuing a combat leadership track. I wanted to ask," she paused, seeming to gather courage, "do you think it's possible for someone like me to become an effective leader in special operations?" I looked at this young woman, seeing in her the same hunger and uncertainty that had driven me to prove myself again and again throughout my career. I thought about all the times I had been underestimated, all the moments when others' limitations became my opportunities, all the situations where being different had been the exact advantage I needed. "Midshipman," I said, "let me tell you something about physical presence and command authority. The most respected leader I ever served under was a Navy SEAL who was barely taller than you are. He earned loyalty not through intimidation, but through competence. Not through physical dominance, but through the ability to make decisions that kept his people alive and brought them home safely." I paused, remembering Chief Thompson and the moment he had first called me commander, remembering how that recognition had changed everything about how I saw myself and my potential. The question isn't whether someone like you can become an effective leader in special operations. The question is whether you're willing to become so competent, so knowledgeable, so skilled at reading situations and making good decisions under pressure that no one will be able to ignore your leadership regardless of how you look or sound or whether you fit their preconceptions about what a leader should be. She nodded, and I could see something shifting in her expression. The same shift I had seen in Lieutenant Walsh, the same transformation I had experienced myself when someone finally told me that my differences weren't disqualifications, but potentially advantages. The military needs leaders who think differently. We need people who see solutions others miss, who can build bridges between different groups, who can earn trust through demonstration rather than demanding it through authority. If you have those qualities, if you're willing to develop them and refine them and use them in service of something larger than yourself, then yes, absolutely,
Someone like you can not only become an effective leader, but can become the kind of leader that others will follow anywhere. 6 months later, I received an email from that midshipman. She had been selected for a competitive summer training program that was designed to identify future special operations officers. Her selection letter, she told me, specifically cited her unconventional approach to problem solving and her ability to build consensus among diverse groups as reasons for her acceptance. But it was the personal message at the end of her email that reminded me why I had chosen to dedicate myself to developing other leaders rather than continuing to pursue my own advancement through the ranks. Ma'am, you probably don't remember our conversation after your presentation at the academy, but it changed my life. For the first time, someone told me that being different wasn't something I needed to overcome, but something I could use as a strength. I wanted you to know that I'm not trying to become a different kind of person anymore. I'm working to become the best version of who I already am. Reading those words, I thought about the journey that had brought me from a kitchen in Cedar Rapids to this moment. From the girl who had been told she would never amount to anything, to the woman who is now helping others recognize their own potential for greatness. From someone who had spent years trying to prove her worth, to someone who could help others discover theirs. The irony was not lost on me. My mother had been wrong about my potential, but in a strange way, her doubt had been the catalyst for everything I had accomplished. Every time she had predicted my failure, she had added fuel to a fire that had eventually burned bright enough to illuminate not just my own path, but the paths of others who needed someone to believe in them. I thought about calling her, about sharing the news of my promotion to director, about telling her about the officers I was training and the impact our program was having on special operations effectiveness around the world. But I realized that I no longer needed her validation or approval. I had found something more valuable, the knowledge that I could create opportunities for others to discover their own strength, their own worth, their own capacity for extraordinary achievement. Instead, I did something different. I started a mentorship program that connected young officers who had been told they weren't leadership material with experienced commanders who had overcome similar challenges. I established a scholarship fund for military dependents who wanted to pursue careers in fields where they had been told they didn't belong. I began speaking regularly at high schools in communities where young people rarely saw examples of what they might become. Because I had learned something important about the nature of success and recognition, the validation that had meant everything to me when I was young, the respect of peers, and the approval of superiors was temporary and external. But the satisfaction of helping someone else discover their own potential, of watching them transform doubt into confidence and insecurity into purpose, that was permanent and internal. The real victory wasn't that Navy SEALs had called me commander. The real victory was that I had become someone worthy of the title, someone who could create safe spaces for others to grow, someone who could see potential where others saw problems, someone who could help build the next generation of leaders who would protect and serve others regardless of whether anyone had ever believed they were capable of doing so. Today, when I walk through the training facilities and see young officers learning to push beyond their perceived limitations, when I receive emails from former students who are now leading their own teams and operations around the world, when I hear stories about missions that succeeded because someone made a decision based on principles we taught them about inclusive leadership and tactical empathy, I know that my mother was wrong about one thing and right about another. She was wrong about what I would amount to. I had become far more than either of us had ever imagined possible. But she was right about one thing. I had never learned to sit still, to accept limitations, to stay within the boundaries that others set for me. And it was precisely that restlessness, that refusal to accept other people's definitions of what was possible, that had carried me to places and opportunities that had seemed impossible from the kitchen of that house in Cedar Rapids. To every young person who has been told they'll never amount to anything, who carries doubt like a stone in their chest, who wonders if the things that make them different are actually disqualifications from the life they want to build, I want you to know this. The people who tell you what you can't become are often just describing the limits of their own imagination, not the boundaries of your potential. Your restlessness might be leadership waiting for the right challenge. Your sensitivity might be tactical awareness that could save lives. Your tendency to question authority might be critical thinking that could prevent disasters. Your refusal to accept conventional wisdom might be the innovative thinking that solves problems no one else can figure out. Find the place where your particular combination of strengths is needed. Develop those strengths with discipline and dedication. Surround yourself with people who see potential where others see problems. And never, ever let someone else's failure of imagination become the ceiling on your own aspirations. The world needs leaders who think differently, who see solutions others miss, who can build bridges across differences and create unity from diversity. If you have those qualities, if you're willing to develop them and use them in service of something larger than yourself, then yes, absolutely.